structural geologists. These are folks that work on how rocks break and what that matters for both groundwater and oil and gas. But I was put to work on Mars. And at that time, we had just started to collect a bunch of new information about Mars. Prior to that, it had been just the Viking era information. But towards the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a real renaissance. And even today, we still have 4 orbiters and at least 1 rover still going on Mars. But we started to learn a whole bunch more than just some pictures. We started to get things like topographic information, gravity data, mineralogical data. And so I was handed over these data sets. No, I was told to go find these data sets. That in itself was a challenge, and start mapping. And not wanting to go forward. And what I was asked to map were these large fault systems. Claritas Mars on Mars, so Claritas Fossae over on Mars is one of the oldest fault systems on the planet. And it looks strikingly similar to the CAMEE lands in Utah, not just at the large scale. So these are several kilometers across, but even at the small scale of individual faults and how their geometries look. This is in Nevada and this is on Mars. And the reason why we were mapping faults on Mars is because faults are really important to our day-to-day life here on Earth. Everywhere from the deep oceans, where we have these communities that live on hydrothermal vents. Everybody talks about the magma being down here, and everybody talks about the ocean water, but what usually gets left out of the conversation is that it's the faults that are creating those communication pathways and allowing that hot water to percolate, become very mineral rich, and essentially creating the chemical energy that's needed to start those ecosystems. Similarly, fault systems, this is the San Andreas. We certainly, have to worry about earthquakes here on Earth because we have active tectonics. This is a cave that's right off of 211 out near Helotes. So in our region of Texas, we have a lot of limestone, and it develops into karst topography, as they call it. But a lot of the karst topography is controlled by the faults in the limestone. So the limestone is there, it then gets broken, and the water is lazy. It finds the crack in the rock rather than trying to go through the solid rock. And so it was all of these things. The researchers that I worked with worked on all of these areas, and they said, we think faults on Mars might be pretty important. And so they sent me to work. And one of the first things I did was download the Mars topography map, which had only at that time not even been a map, it was individual tracks. And in this map, this is a map of Mars. Where you're seeing red, those are high regions, and where you're seeing blue, those are low regions. And just to get everybody oriented a little bit, there's a couple big features on Mars that just really stand out. One is this big, tall region. This is called the Tharsis Bulge. And it is essentially a long-standing region of volcanic activity. Mars does not have the plate tectonics that we have. Continents have not moved around. Crust has not been recycled. Instead, there's a giant magmatic plume that has more or less been long-lived for over 4 billion years, and it pops up in different places over different areas of time. The other major thing on Mars that we see is what we call the dichotomy boundary. The northern part of Mars is lower in topography, and it also has less craters. And less craters means that it is geologically younger at the surface than the lower region, which is heavily cratered and a little topographically higher. What we have subsequently learned is that the crust is actually even thinner here in the north than it is in the south. And so I was given this region and said, go find some interesting fault systems on Mars. I said, well, here's a big one right here, Valles Marineris. And they said, no, we're kind of looking for a little bit more than that, a little bit more getting into the structural geology. And so I chose as my area of research this volcano up here, Agua Patera. And I chose it in large part because no one else had been really doing a whole lot of study on it. And because it had a lot of fault systems that went north-south and then kind of went a bit around this volcano, and then they continue up to the north. And so zooming into this area, one particular area, what I was tasked with doing was mapping in GIS all of these normal extensional faults. Extensional faults are called normal. And so these are areas where the crust was pulled apart. And when you get that in over a large regional area, you can develop what's called horst and graben formations. The graben is the down drop part, the horst is the higher standing bit. And so I spent several months mapping all of these. But what I was really interested in were these holes in the ground that I was finding everywhere I was mapping these normal faults. And after a couple months, I went back and said, you know, I really want to study these holes in the ground. And they said, okay, go at it. And so I did. And one of the things that I really noticed about these particular pit chains, as they were called, was their geomorphology. So what were their general shapes? For one, these are collapsed pits. They, in general, lack any kind of rim. So here's an impact crater on Mars, and here's pit crater chains. The impact craters have a rim to them that's just more high standing than the rest of the pit, and they typically have an ejecta blanket around it. These pits had no rims and typically no ejecta blankets or anything else. And by the way, I will say it's been my experience over the years that about a quarter of us, and I'm going to raise my hand, are not seeing holes in the ground. You're seeing hills. I call it topographic dyslexia, for lack of a better word. I assure you, these are holes. I've looked at it very closely, but still to this day, I see hills. I don't see holes. So if that's you, you know, you're in good company. The other kind of collapse features we often get on Mars are calderas, volcanic calderas. So often when you're developing a volcano and it's spewing out magma, there's a magma chamber over there. When that magma has, you know, kind of run its course, it can start to drain back or solidify and in effect start collapsing. And one of the notable things about volcanic calderas is they're often nested. So you'll get pits within pits, as opposed to the pit crater chains, which, as the name implies, are often in a line. And so we have well over 2,000 of these on Mars. I know because I mapped over 1,500 of them during my master's thesis. And they're found essentially all over the planet, but they're not necessarily ubiquitous, right? We see them in a lot of places, but they have clear associations. And just some other pictures so you can get an idea of the kind of features that these are. This is one particular pit, and I'll note that this is a 500-meter scale bar. So this is, you know, several kilometers across, and that is typical. Most of these are on the order of a kilometer or two in width and a half a kilometer in depth. So these are really big holes in the ground. They do typically form in chains. Like I was saying, they are often associated with extensional faulting, but we even get in areas, this is the Noctis labyrinthus, which I always called the obnoxious labyrinth because I had to map it, that you can get them going in all kinds of directions in this kind of polygonal fracturing pattern. And so the first thing that I did, you know, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm just playing one as a student intern. First thing I did was go to the literature and say, what do other people think these holes in the ground are? And the first explanation that popped up was lava tubes. And so lava tubes, for those of you that might not know, is when you get a lava flow and it erupts on the surface, the ground's pretty cold, the air's pretty cold. And so what happens is you develop essentially a skin on that lava flow. It starts to solidify from the outside in, but the inside stays pretty hot. And what you do is you can effectively start to channelize that hot magma or hot lava within that lava flow, and it will start to form essentially a river of lava within that lava flow. Eventually, the magma production gets shut off, the lava drains out of the tube, and we're left with effectively a long tube, looks a lot like a tunnel that you would see, you know, us building into a mountain. One of the critical things about lava tubes, though, is that one, they are confined to planets that have had active volcanism in the past. They are confined typically to a single lava flow. So you're not going to see the same tube continue on to another lava flow that happened, you know, millions of years later. And they're also pretty confined to that unit vertically as well. So you can get some thermal erosion down to the next layer, but it's not going to thermally erode all the way down. And so they are often limited in extent in that way. And also lava tubes follow gravity just like water does. So they're going to flow downhill. The other major hypotheses that were out there when I started this adventure was that magmatic dikes had something to do with this. And this wasn't a crazy notion. The stress fields that create extensional faulting are the exact same stress fields that create magmatic dikes. And so there was a couple different flavors of the dike hypothesis. And magmatic dikes, I should say, is that you have a magma chamber somewhere down here, and you get a vertical, often planar. So it looks like a long and thin sheet of basalt, but you get this linear feature coming up through the crust. And in this case, it's hitting a cryosphere or a hydrosphere. It's hitting water or ice. And of course, the hot magma hitting this water or ice almost instantaneously turns it into steam, and it creates what we call a phreatomagmatic eruption. And in doing that, it's creating also these explosive type of pits. Another alternative hypothesis to this was that these dikes on Mars are hypothesized to be actually quite wide, hundreds of meters in width, and up to kilometers in length. And because they're so big, it's the potential for volatiles. And when I say volatiles, I just mean gases. So excuse me if I get too jargony. I try to keep it a little bit more straightforward. But the gases that were in the magma are now, much like you open a can of soda, they're coming out of solution, and they collect at the tip of the dike in a kind of foamy material, and that is not strong enough to hold the rock that's above it, so the rock starts collapsing into this void space where the foam was. And the third dike hypothesis was that you get essentially large eruptions, so you don't need the water involved, and you don't need an extensive amount of volatiles, but essentially the dikes come up and they are so explosive that they essentially blow big holes in the ground. There was also the idea that you would have these large magma chambers, and in this case, all of these little lines are representing individual dikes. And when the magma eventually, goes away, either because it erupts somewhere else or it solidifies out, that you would end up collapsing down on top of where you had a magmatic system. There was also the argument, much like what we have here in Texas, that this could be karst topography. So if you have soluble rocks like limestone, and you have slightly acidic water like carbon dioxide getting into the water, that you can essentially dissolve out the rocks and then form collapse. The other hypothesis was that these are all just fracture driven. And by fractures, I mean simple kind of mode 1 opening of rock, and then you're creating a void space and the material's collapsing into it. And then the last one was the one that I got into my discussion with my advisor on, is whether or not we were dealing with dilational faults. And the major difference between a fracture and a fault is that a fault has some amount of displacement, up, down, side to side. It has moved. It's not just opened, but it's moved. And so what dilational faults essentially are that as you break through different rock types, those rock types have different amounts of strength. Some are strong, some are weak. And the stronger the rock, typically the steeper the fault, the dip of the fault. And weaker rocks, it gets more shallow. And so you end up with a system where you get a zigzag. But as you pull that apart, you can actually pull open or dilate certain segments of the fault zone. And so, yeah, my first introduction to science is, wow, lots of ideas. They can't all be happening in the same place. So what's going on here? And so how did I start testing this? Well, the first thing I wanted to do, since I was already mapping, was try to figure out where are these things occurring. And so this is a gray and fuzzy image that took me over 3 months to map at zoomed in very close. So it doesn't tell you a whole lot, but other than these pit crater chains do occur over a large range of places, but they're not scattered everywhere. They're associated primarily with the large volcanic systems, these are volcanoes. They're associated with large uplift regions, and they're also associated with the Valles Marineris, which has been pulled apart. And the other thing that I noticed after mapping all of these pit crater chains over the planet Mars was that there was a really clear evolution to these things. That you could see pit chains that were incipient. They were just starting, and they would end up being these little pits all in a line. And then you'd find other ones where you could see the pits start to coalesce together into these longer elongated pits. And then they would eventually start to evolve into these, what we called scallop troughs. And sometimes even within the troughs themselves, you'd get a secondary line of pit crater chains. So there was a clear evolution to these things. They didn't start out looking like this. They appeared to be going from this to this to this. And because I was actually supposed to be mapping the faults, not the pit crater chains, and one of the things that I really wanted to do was, to me, there was a clear association of these pit crater chains to the extensional faulting. And so we took the fault mapping that I'd done and the pit crater chain mapping and tried to look at what the stress state was to form these faults. And so in the center, we have what's called the slip tendency. How prone were these faults to slip? And over here, how prone are these faults to dilate? And the takeaway here is on the right. These faults are very, they're very north-south trending. So they have a very consistent orientation to the faults, as do the pit chains. And these faults are actually primed to dilate. So this was starting to hang together. So the next thing I did, these pit chains, although I said they're very large, they're actually kind of smaller than the resolution of our topographic data. So it was difficult to use the topographic data to get really good handle on just how big of a hole are we talking about here. And so a lot of the volume calculations that I did were done off of photogrammetry, looking at the shadows of the pit, trying to figure out exactly how deep it would be. And the reason why this was important to me was because if I have a hole this big and all of that material drained into the subsurface, it means I have a hole in the subsurface at least that big. And if these are all in a big chain, that's a lot of void space underground. So it was a lot of kind of simple geometric arguments, but trying to get a handle on just how much accommodation space, void space is there in the subsurface under these pits. Another thing that kind of fell out of doing those measurements was that these pits don't all have the same slopes. Some of them are incredibly steep and some of them are incredibly shallow. And the two things came out of that. One is that the more shallower ones in general appeared to be older. So, you know, they're infilling, and so that's helping to shallow them. And it may be because of seismic activity, that's also helping mass wasting kind of help fill them up. Whereas the youngest looking pit crater chains on Mars were still very, very steep. The other part of that likely has to do with the function of the material that these pits are draining into. And so that work directly led to this work some years later, where I did pretty simple experiments here. I took glass beads and pumice and sipped them to the same grain size. They're more or less dust or powdered, you know, but essentially created a hole, put my material in a box, created a hole, let those holes drain. And what we found was the pumice, which under microscope is really jagged, irregular shape, has these high aspect ratios. That material produces a very, a small diameter, but very deep pit versus my glass beads, which are spheres, which produces a very wide and very shallow sloped pit. And so in general, what this is telling us is that you can kind of use these pit craters as a proxy for the type of material and the strength of the material that you might be dealing with if you have no other information. And so having done all of that, I had to really revisit all of those hypotheses. And one by one, I knocked them down. One, lava tubes. There are certainly lava tubes on Mars, no doubt. But what I was looking at, the vast majority of these pit crater chains were not lava tubes. One, they weren't sinuous, they were highly linear. They often crossed topography rather than going downhill. And they weren't confined to single lava flows. Similarly to the dikes, what the dike hypotheses all lacked was any surface evidence of this kind of volcanic activity. There was not evidence of Mar eruptions or pyroclastic deposits or cinder cones or lava flows emanating out of these. And so a lot of the dike hypotheses simply just didn't have that concurrent evidence to go with it. Not that I certainly think there's probably dikes on Mars, but I'm not convinced that they're creating pit crater chains. Similarly, with the collapsed magma chambers, this might work for a large region like the Valles Marineris, but it didn't work for some of the smaller pit crater chains that we found across the planet. I would love to invoke the karst hypothesis, but there isn't a lot of evidence for soluble rocks like limestone on Mars, and certainly not in large regions. The folks that originally hypothesis also said that this should be confined to the equatorial regions, and yet we find pit crater chains across the planet. And so it really came down to two different modes. Either it's extensional fracturing or it's dilational faulting. And the only real distinguishing between the two is that extensional fractures can only propagate so far into the subsurface before they will eventually transition into a fault. And so we argued that it's probably dilational faulting. And so just to give you guys, hopefully this will work. Nope, didn't. Go back. Let's see if I can make it work. Yes. And so what we hypothesized was that you have a fault develop. It runs into these different stratigraphies. In particular, it gets into a strong one where it becomes very steep. And as you continue to extend that, you create these large dilational segments, and the material above, mostly what we call regolith, just loose material, starts to drain into it. And so simply stating it so and drawing a pretty picture doesn't really make it so. And so my next steps were to try to demonstrate this in the lab. And so what you're looking at here is we had a model set up where I created a fault that had a 65-degree dip on it. The dark gray material was a really strong cohesive, the dark gray material was two pieces of plywood that were cut on a single vertical fracture between them. Then I used a cohesive powder, which you can kind of see, it's the white that pops up. And so that was highly cohesive. And then the blue was sand, and that was very loose and very weak. And so started to pull this model apart, let it both slide down that fault and dilate open. And as you can see, we were able to recreate how these pit crater chains evolve. One thing that I'll note to you is that my models were very consistent on that dilation across the entire segment. But the pit chains all don't form at once. They tend to pop up in various places. Some start to merge, others do not. And even at the end, after there was several millimeters of space and gap unavailable to it, there were still areas that never collapsed. But there was still, I knew, an underlying void space to it. And so my next step was to actually try to find field analog sites for this. And that was actually much more difficult than I thought it would be. And I'll show you why. This is a case example from Iceland. And for scale, this is a road down here, just to give you an idea. And we're looking at a fluvial plain. So this is where a river occasionally outwashes. So it's a lot of just, fine, not muddy because it's dry, but a lot of fine alluvial sediments. And this is from 1958, satellite imagery. And you can, if you squint, kind of see some linear features going north-south here. And then in 1976, there was a major series of earthquakes in this region. And suddenly we have these large grabens. So these were two normal faults with a down drop block, and the development of these pit crater chains. But just 8 years later, the river overflowed. You can see where it flowed through here. It nearly erases this graben entirely. And in that 8 years, even though there wasn't a whole lot of seismic activity, we were still creating pit crater chains. And so what this work showed was that pit crater chains develop very quickly, and they can be erased very quickly, especially on Earth, where we have such an active erosional cycle. And so I contacted the only person I know that had been in this region, and he sent me this picture from when they went out there in 1975. And I'll just note Brand Potters standing in a pit, because when I went out there, this is what they looked like in 2008. So there's me standing in the same pit. And so one thing to note is how steep these pits are, when they first developed, how linear they are. These are two normal faults that are flanking them, and the pits are all nicely in a line. Fast forward to 2008, and what you notice is that all of the pits are filled with vegetation. That should be clue number one as to why I think pit crater chains is important. So typically we're dealing with some sparse vegetation in this area, but after the pit chain formation, that void space that is under these pit chains is clearly controlling the groundwater, and it's giving these plants access to that groundwater where they don't in the other regions surrounding it. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like when you're standing over them, this is what the pits look like on the surface. And as you can see, they are very steep walled. The first foot or two of this is essentially soils and mosses. And then below that is primarily basaltic rock. So pretty solid, but heavily fractured rock. The key part here is this is the dilational segment. So if you climb into that pit, and you can walk along some of these, they are quite wide, quite high. And although it's not really clear here, this is the groundwater right under my feet. And so we see these all over Mars, and every time we do, I think of this picture. I think of, wow, that's a lot of room. It's a lot of room for life. It's a lot of room for resources to be. And so this sent me off onto other places. Are these only on Earth and Mars? And the answer is no. They're found, as I've learned, almost everywhere. And so this is a close-up of the asteroid Eros, where we also find these graben, but a lot of these graben, as you can see, trend into these pit chains and scallop troughs. And so what we think is going on here is that we have these large extensional or dilational faults on the asteroid, and the regolith material at the top is draining into it. And this is not a very big feature, but nonetheless, these pits are still several kilometers to several meters across. And so we wanted to try to understand back to, can we use these slopes on these pits to tell us anything? So trying to do some numerical models to really try to understand, get that out of the way, really try to understand, how this regolith material would behave. Can we use the pit to say how thick that material is? And the answer is no, it's not as unique of a solution as we had hoped. But anybody's interested, I want to revisit this. We found pit crater chains on Venus. Venus has a ton of volcanoes and a ton of extensional faulting, but yet the pit crater chains are found there as well. One of the things that was interesting on Venus was it was one of the few circumstances where we found pit crater chains that appeared to have lava flowing out of them. So one of the few circumstances where it could be dikes. I still think that really what we had is we had normal faulting, dilational faulting, the pit crater chain formation, and then subsequent magma injection. And again, the magma is following the path of least resistance there. There's already this nice void space for it to fill and flow along. The one that got me really excited, about 10 years ago was Enceladus. So Enceladus is an icy moon of Saturn. You guys might remember Cassini found geysers coming out of its south pole. This is in the northern hemisphere of Enceladus. And what they found there was pit chains. And this excites me because we thought it was relatively inactive, should have been a dead little icy moon. And instead we have geysers in the south and pit chains in the north. The soil, the regolith of Enceladus, in this case, is effectively snow. And that snow is collapsing into what appear to be normal faults through the ice crust. I also managed to go to one of the other places that has really great examples of these pit crater chains. So Hawaii, you know, if you're going to choose field sites, choose a research topic that will send you to Iceland and Hawaii. Heads up. This is Devil's Throat. This is approximately 150 meters across. And this is standing on the rim of it. There is no raised rim. If you're walking along here, if you didn't know it was there, you could die, essentially. This is an owl for scale. And I had my daughter on that trip, made her stand 20 feet away from it at all times. It really is quite striking how deep these things are. But they also form in smaller scale. So this is the tephra deposits off of Kilauea Iki. So a small volcano off of the larger volcano of Kilauea. And this is mainly what we call tephra deposits. So gravel-sized material, loose, unconsolidated. But what we found, or what I found, was that these pit chains are forming along there as well in real time. And one of the cool things about it, graduate students for scale, is that you can, unlike impact craters dig into the subsurface, right? And they give us a peek into the subsurface, but they're very violent and destructive events. These pit crater chains, they're collapsing. And one of the things that they're really good at doing is showing us the subsurface stratigraphy without destroying it like an impact crater would. On Mars, in particular, one of the things that I noticed during my mapping was that a lot of these pit crater chains would eventually transition into fluvial or water erosional features. And so one of the arguments that we were trying to put forth is that these pit crater chains and their subsurface dilational faults are actually helping to channel groundwater or have channeled groundwater in the past on Mars. And ultimately, this is off the side of a volcano. Again, same kind of topography. So this is high and this is low, and they're all running downhill. But these pit chains up here, which are a little difficult to see, are actually crossing topography. So the pit chains are not controlled by the topography, but the outflow of water coming out of them, it's running downhill. And again, coming back to the examples out in the field, this is in Hawaii. This is in the middle of a large volcanic field. There's almost no vegetation. And we were doing a mapping exercise of the lava flows themselves. And we were looking at satellite imagery and primarily looking at the mineralogy from this information. And what I kept seeing was pit crater chains on this map. And so I finally just said, I've got to figure out why I'm seeing these pit crater chains, because they should be the same material as the surrounding rock. Why would they pop up on a satellite imagery? So I wandered over there, and lo and behold, the reason why they were looking spectrally different was because there were plants there where there weren't plants anywhere else. And similarly, we talked about this in Iceland. You can definitely see the control on groundwater inside these dilational faults. And so ongoing, I'm still working on doing both physical models and numerical models. I'm always open to more collaboration on that. One of the things that also fell out on this, and again, this was how I got into science, was it didn't just end with the holes in the ground. You know, I still to this day argue with my colleagues in the field as to whether or not dikes are creating these features. And so I ended up doing quite a bit of work just trying to figure out what kind of deformation magmatic dikes would actually create. And so doing everything from trying to map them in the field to, you know, trying to do numerical simulations of what kind of stress would end up evolving if you had a dike, or you had magma in the subsurface. Doing a whole lot of mapping on Mars, trying to see, you know, what do these cross-sectional slopes on these things look like. And in particular, why this became very interesting to me was because we started moving towards in situ research utilization, or ISRU, as it's often shortened to. And so we did quite a bit of work looking at these fault-bounded province and pit crater chains, and then where you could see water flowing out to the north of them. So if we have water flowing through these faults, these are off the sides of volcano, the odds of us having some really great minerals to mine are pretty high as well. And that's not even talking about the potential for astrobiology. And so I ended up, because I also did a lot of work for oil and gas, tried to determine if I was just looking for groundwater, can I use the principles of oil and gas, which is charge, reservoir, and trap? You know, can I use those same kind of basic tools of oil and gas to try to determine how much water is there and how much could we potentially extract? And so to wrap it up here, why are pit crater chains important? Why have I spent nearly 20 years at this point studying holes in the ground? And it's because this one little feature on Mars opened up a whole big old bag of worms. And probably the biggest thing that I learned is that scientists don't agree. We don't have all the answers. I was flat out mad that there wasn't, why hasn't anybody studied this before? Why don't we have that answer yet? And the answer is because you haven't studied it yet. And so I know that we talk a lot about exploration in general as in our field. And there are certainly a lot of, I know the CAMEE group put in a proposal just to explore lava tubes, which is also a very good target of exploration. But I'm here to tell you that pit crater chains are easy to identify. They're pretty notable in imagery. We don't need spectral instruments. We don't need topography. We don't need gravity. I can see them in pictures. They represent a tremendous amount of void space in the subsurface. And they're found everywhere. Unlike lava flows, I've found them on asteroids, I've found them on icy moons, I've found them on terrestrial planetary bodies. So they're pretty ubiquitous. In particular, these dilational faults that underlie these pit crater chains really have a lot of subsequent, follow-on interesting things to think about, like the control of not just groundwater, but magma, and also any kind of volatiles or gas. These areas become these permeability pathways from the subsurface to the surface. And some of them never make it to the surface, which makes them excellent traps for these materials. But for the same reason that we have the groundwater and the magma and the volatiles and these things, these also become the food and housing for any potential astrobiology. Now, not all of these pit crater chains might necessarily house humans, but they're certainly large enough to house astrobiology at a bacterial or level or better. And so when we talk about exploration, one of the things that I think is still missing in this conversation is a discussion with terrestrial exploration scientists. I have spent a good part of my career working with the oil and gas industry, not because I was going to go in the oil and gas industry, it's because the oil and gas industry has a tremendous amount of data. They have millions of dollars to throw at a problem that I'm trying to figure out on Mars, where I have about 3 data points. And so learning their tricks of the trade, learning their processes has really been informative to how we might approach research utilization on the moon or Mars or any of these asteroids. And so I think at that point, I will leave it there and open it up to questions.